All right, so we are here with the final part of our pre-Vietnam part of the Cold War unit. So we are looking at the Kennedy years. So the previous video, we looked at Eisenhower and his responses with brinkmanship, massive retaliation, the growth of nuclear weapons, and also the beginnings of the space race part within um, the context of the Cold War. And that's going to be something we're going to refer back to at this point. This issue with Berlin was also mentioned in the last video too. So we're pretty far along at this point. So what we're going to look at today is kind of explaining the various ways that Kennedy dealt with Cold War issues. Now, Kennedy, unfortunately, has kind of that tragic part where he's only president for about, 2.5 years, due to the fact that he gets assassinated in November 1963. So kind of something to consider here within the context of this stuff right here, which was something we would do more in class. Kind of as review, like explaining what the policy of containment is, and then what have been economic and political examples of it. But essentially, we also want to consider with Andrei Zadanov, the guy from the Soviet Union, his predictions about the U.S. actions after World War II, in terms of the U.S. is going to try and support all these groups that are going to be in essence anti the United States because they want to nationalize industries, they want independence. And how is the United States going to react to that? So again, consider things like within Egypt, within Nicaragua, if you've looked at that in the textbook, as well as also in Iran about U.S. actions at this point, to the U.S. responses within governments and all that stuff. So again, these are things to keep in mind within U.S. actions. So this will cover kind of that whole last part about everything prior to the Vietnam conflict, which is going to be kind of taking up the second half of the unit, and kind of the big other focus that we're going to look at here. So within this context too, there's also going to be a little assignment at the end of today on kind of the whole point, or not the whole point, but context within the space race and how that's kind of affected things both short-term and long-term with technology and the way we live our lives in society. So here's our map of the 1960 presidential election in terms of the Electoral College. All right. So it was a contentious thing. We got this young guy here, John F. Kennedy, World War II veteran, against Vice President Richard Nixon. All right. Nixon has been serving as Eisenhower's VP, and it's a pretty contentious vote. He comes down to this, about 100,000 in the popular vote here. About 500,000 of those vote for Mr. Byrd here in the South, which was still at that point fairly democratically strong, splitting that in Oklahoma, Mississippi, and Alabama. In the Electoral College, again, it doesn't seem that close, but when the popular vote is that tight, in many of these cases, it's a very quick swing. All right. So Kennedy gets elected, and he's kind of looked at as this really young guy. He doesn't have a whole lot of great experience. He's been in Congress for the last 12 years. First as a congressman, then as a senator out of Massachusetts. But essentially, he's kind of looked at as he's very young. Truman served in the Senate for a long time, but he was a World War I veteran. Eisenhower was this great general and kind of saw the United States through the 50s. So he has to deal with a lot of other things, but kind of builds on his own little legacy here for the short time he's in office. So the ways in which he is similar to Truman and Eisenhower. So these are things to consider in terms of what are the differences between the various presidents and their actions. Okay. Like the two of them, he continues to use economic aid, so much like the Truman Doctrine, providing money towards governments and groups that are fighting for pro-democracy values or things that support the United States, and military supplies to anti-communist rebels and governments. So this is a continuation, all right? On top of that, in the same vein, Kennedy creates what we call the Peace Corps, right, to aid nations through humanitarian efforts. So not just economic aid and military supplies, but also helping them to build schools, hospitals, roads, train people within the countries to do these things in order to better support themselves. Because again, the idea is that if we contain communism, we give people enough hope, enough resources to provide for themselves, they will turn towards democracy and not communism. All right, and the people in the country will do the same. So that's one of the reasons why the Peace Corps gets created, to kind of help stabilize these countries, primarily in South and Central America when it starts out, but obviously the Peace Corps works globally now. And AmeriCorps within inside the United States does the same thing, more domestic-based. All right. So at the same time, there's continued CIA operations, and the number of ICBMs and nuclear weapons that we looked at in the last video it's all within the same presentation, but it was in the last video when we looked at that, continues to build. All right, so you can go back to that slide within this presentation and take a look at that in terms of the fact that these numbers continue to grow. All right, how Kennedy is different. All right, he pushes for the increase of the space race for NASA. All right, leading to the U.S. to put somebody on the moon by the year 1969. He pledges that in 1961 that his goal is to put a man on the moon and use that technology because it is the new frontier, it is the new uncharted territory, the new exploration for what we have not yet discovered. And also, we're doing this because the Soviets are getting further along in the space race than we are, okay? They are the first ones to put satellites up there, first people to put people into space for long periods of time. So the U.S. is behind, and they need to, catch up. So there's more investments in engineering, in science and technology, all right, in mathematical education, is pushed out by the Kennedy administration, as well as physical education, too, again, to be on par with the Soviets and the communists, all right? But also, he believes in the buildup of the regular military at the same time. So soldiers and equipment, not just nuclear weapons, but this has to be maintained as well, as the United States believes it'll have to, at some point again, combat the Soviet Union or communist regimes and governments elsewhere, including Vietnam. All right? So what is this? This is the Sputnik satellite, okay? That is the first one, and then, for those that ever watch the TV show Friends, Ross dressed up, Spud, Potato, Nick with the antenna, Sputnik. All right? So his belief is we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard, and because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. So being able to prove that we can actually go into space and we can land on the moon and we can further exploration, and it'll also have those benefits. So that's why there's going to be that assignment with this today about how does this affect us in the long term. The stuff that we did with space exploration, going to the moon, how does that impact us today with the technology and the investments that we made back in the 60s? All right? So in terms of the challenges that Kennedy faces, Cuba is the big factor here for the Kennedy administration. So Cuba became communist in the end of the 1950s. All right, they went through a regime change where this guy, Fidel Castro, who was the first pretty much communist leader inside of Cuba for about 50-odd years, 55 years, now his younger brother, who is also very elderly, I think Castro is dead now, now his younger brother, who is also fairly old at this point, is in command. So here is Fidel Castro with Nikita Khrushchev, who is one of the guys who takes over after Joseph Stalin dies in 1952. And so within that, Kennedy has, or makes a decision after Castro overthrows the Cuban government, which, mind you, this happened during the Eisenhower administration. All right, they chose to ally with the Soviet Union. They could have allied with the United States, but they chose not to. All right, but they nationalized the U.S. businesses that are inside of Cuba. So casinos, healthcare, industries that were selling stuff to the United States and the United States businesses were making money on. All of a sudden, that stuff gets taken away and essentially becomes part of Cuba's economy more than it does the United States' economy by, again, that nationalism, put them under the Cuban government. So the U.S. government feels very uncomfortable having a communist country so close to the United States. All right? We're talking 90 miles to Florida at the closest point between Cuba and the United States. It's 90 miles. So the United States has always said that any threat to the United States inside the Western Hemisphere, and this goes back into the 1820s, not something we talked about in class, but if you'd done APUS, this is something that you would have learned about. So we feel very uncomfortable. This is a very big threat that Kennedy feels that he has to deal with, but how do we do that? So the first action Kennedy takes is what we call the Bay of Pigs operation. So the Bay of Pigs is a name of an actual bay, a location in Cuba, that had been conceived by the Eisenhower administration that Kennedy chooses to go forward with. So using Cuban rebels, people that oppose the Castro regime, to invade and overthrow, but it fails miserably. All right. So they are trained by the CIA. They're given U.S. equipment, U.S. arms. There's a couple thousand of them that try this. Completely overwhelmed within a matter of hours. It fails very quickly. And it looks pretty bad for, the Kennedy administration. So this happened, I believe, at the end of 62 or the beginning of 63. You can see the date here on Life magazine. May 1963. Does not look good for the United States. So Kennedy admits to the mistake. He admits that we planned this. We gave them support. And makes the United States look really, really weak. This is the first real major failure that the United States faces and especially for a young president. All right. So then later in 1962, or was it 63? Sorry. In 1962, yeah, this is Bay of Pigs happened in 62. Happened again. So this is 1962 in the fall. We notice, again, via the use of the U-2 aircrafts, that the Soviet Union is putting nuclear weapons in Cuba. All right, in response to the United States putting U.S. or nuclear weapons in Turkey. And these weapons here were actually pretty defective. They were going to be restricted anyway. But essentially, again, this is the idea of the massive retaliation. We can strike really, really quickly, and essentially nuclear war, nuclear bombs can be floating across the globe within 90 minutes and hit anywhere on the globe pretty much. So the Soviet Union plants these nuclear weapons, or is attempting to, just in case, because the United States has these located so close to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, they don't feel comfortable with it. So if you're the president, what do you do if there's nuclear weapons this close to the United States, where essentially everything but the West Coast can be hit almost instantaneously? Miami was pretty close, they could be hit in minutes. Washington within about a half hour. What would you do? So again, there's another video on this here within the Cuban Missile Crisis. Feel free to take a look at that. But his response is, instead of invading Cuba, instead of attacking Cuba, Kennedy decides we are going to blockade Cuba, prevent more nuclear weapons from entering, and threaten to attack the Soviets if they come any close to Cuba. So there's this whole great thing. If you have HBO, there's a great movie called 13 Days that essentially looks at this entire issue. It's a very good historical film about how close the United States and the Soviet Union came to actual nuclear war. Like, if when we talk about the whole buildup of the Cold War, how close we are to nuclear conflict, this is as close as we really come. All right, we are talking about within minutes that we were really ready to start launching airstrikes and then possibly nuclear attacks on each other. All right, so we set up this line to ensure that ships do not come into the area, and that the Soviets are going to back down and go back. All right, and they come within several hundred meters of that line before we start letting everything fly, and then we reach a deal with the Soviet Union. All right, so the agreement is the Soviet Union is going to remove the nuclear weapons from Cuba, and the U.S. will pull theirs out of Turkey. And so while Cuba will remain communist, we are not going to interfere in Cuba. We have to live with that. It is also going to prevent nuclear war, and we are going to back off. Now, again, the thing is because of those other nuclear deterrents, those ICBMs that we mentioned in the last video, all of our tactical nuclear subs and the nuclear aircraft, having something this close, while threatening, both countries could hit each other within a matter of minutes anyway, regardless of the location of these land-based ones in Cuba and Turkey. All right? But again, this is the closest we ever come to these scenarios. So Kennedy stands up pretty tall with this ultimatum of, you will not put these here, and we will back down in Turkey if you back down here. So they do reach that agreement. But again, it really came within a blink of an eye before either side started firing at each other. And who knows whether that would have led to nuclear war. But definitely missiles were about to start flying until they came to an agreement here. So that's where we're going to end with this part of the unit and this part of the presentation. So make sure that you've taken the quiz. Make sure you look at that space race assignment that is on Schoology. And then the next stuff we're going to start looking at is the Vietnam conflict. So this is where we stop for this part.